Hello again, and welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk general aviation with relevant news and flying tips for pilots and student pilots to help keep you safe. I'm Max Truscott. I'm the author of several books on the Garmin G1000, G3000, G5000, and Perspective Glass cockpits, and the 2008 National Flight Instructor of the Year. Today we're talking about the fatal Pilatus PC-12 crash that occurred in November 2019 in South Dakota. Last week, the NTSB released the public docket in the case, though not the final report. The factual report shows the pilot made many mistakes, but he might have succeeded had he not made one final mistake. Last week in episode 230, we talked about the crash of a Cessna 208 Caravan on approach to Burley, Idaho last month, the visual illusion of flying in mist and fog, and about a moving map error at Burley. So if you didn't hear that episode, you may want to check it out at aviationnewstalk.com/230. And this is a listener-supported show, so yes, we're still ad-free. So think about what you might pay for an hour of really great ground instruction, and then sign up to join us as a member to support the show financially by going out to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome, and when you do, I'll read your name on the air. This week in the news, the first private check ride in the U.S. in an electric airplane has occurred. Jet A is now more expensive than avgas in many locations, and an airline passenger was able to get a door open while the airliner was still in flight. All this and more, and the news starts now. From flyingmag.com, U.S. Aviation First, private pilot certificate earned using an electric airplane. For the first time in the U.S., a student pilot has earned his private using an electric aircraft. Shane Fisher flew his check ride in a Pipistrel Velis Electro on March 6th at Wright Rudder Aviation's flight school at the Florida Inverness Airport. The two-seat trainer is the world's first electric-powered airplane to receive a type certificate. It was certificated by EASA in 2020, but in the U.S. it operates under light sport experimental aircraft rules. Wright Rudder released a statement last week saying, quote, "This is a fantastic accomplishment for both Shane and the aviation industry as a whole, as this major milestone demonstrates the exciting possibilities and reality of electric aircraft in the training market here in the U.S." He completed the cross-country requirements for his certificate in a Pipistrel Cirrus SW with a similar airframe to the Velis, powered by a Rotax 912 engine. Fisher of Ultimate Aviation has since become a Pipistrel dealer, representing the brand in the Philadelphia area. The Velis Electro, a single power plant aircraft aimed at the pilot training market, has an empty weight with batteries of 941 pounds and a maximum takeoff weight of 1,320 pounds, payload of 378 pounds, and a maximum speed of 98 knots. The airplane has a maximum endurance of 50 minutes plus reserve and a maximum recharging time of 1 to 2 hours. From AINonline.com, Pipistrel seeking to fly the electric Velis trainer under new FAA rules. Pipistrel is hoping to export its electrically powered Velis Electro to the U.S. in larger numbers after the FAA implements new regulations that would allow it to be operated more easily there, the company announced at Aero Friedrichshafen show in Germany. This move comes almost 2 years after it became the first manufacturer to certify an electric aircraft. The FAA's new Mosaic regulations, and Mosaic stands for Modernization of Special Airworthiness Certification, would make it easier for light aircraft like the Velis Electro to fly in the U.S. without having to go through the burdensome Part 23 certification process. The Velis Electro does fly now in the U.S., but only under an experimental airworthiness certificate. Shortly after being acquired by Textron earlier this month, Pipistrel signaled its intent to offer the Velis in the U.S. flight training market. For now, EASA and FAA certification, they don't match, said Pipistrel product manager Tajek Hozik. But as I understand, the FAA will issue rules for the electric airplane soon, and I think in a year this aircraft will be available also in the U.S. under FAA rules, he said. Pipistrel is building 20 aircraft per month and brings a variety of capabilities to its new owners, from composite manufacturing to new urban air mobility programs and electric aircraft. From avweb.com, Jet A more expensive than avgas. For the first time in recent memory, the price of Jet A was higher than that of 100 low-lead in April in some areas, in a huge spike in prices that has been building over the last couple of months. Jeffrey Carruthers, the CEO of Global Air, a fuel price tracking service, said, quote, "This is our first time seeing anything like this." Jet A is now within a whisker of $8 a gallon in New England, although the price varies widely throughout the U.S. It's as low as $6.10 in the central region, which is a lot higher than the low of $4.49 in May of 2020. Quote, just as we have seen demand for aircraft unlike anything in recent decades and how that has impacted jet prices, we are now seeing that in the aviation fuel market, Carruthers said. Only in the Western Pacific region is Jet A cheaper at $7.09 a gallon than avgas at $7.15 a gallon, but in most markets the two are within 50 cents in price. From GeneralAviationNews.com, spring training for GA pilots. The FAA will host an online spring training workshop for GA pilots May 19, 2022. The online workshop is designed to help GA pilots reduce the risk of airfield errors and lower the potential for accidents during the spring and summer flying seasons, according to the FAA. Pilots and air traffic experts will discuss a number of topics, including knowledge of runway geometry and signage, hotspot standardization, arrival alert notices, and more. Aviation experts will participate in 4 safety panel discussions. Those are what we see on the runways today, new runway safety tools, the danger of rust and inattention, and from the flight deck and from the tower. The webinar will be held via Zoom from 1:30 to 4:30 p.m. Eastern Time, and pilots can earn wings credit for attending. Now, I've included a link in our show notes where you can sign into the webinar, and if you do, you'll need the password, which is 484283, in order to log into the webinar, which will also be streamed live via YouTube. From thisisreno.com, Reno pilot appeals FAA suspension, says precedent poses threat for backcountry pilots. Reno backcountry pilot Trent Palmer last week on YouTube shared the story of his pilot license suspension, making national aviation headlines. Palmer is a drone pilot and filmmaker, but also pilots a Stoll Kit Fox 5 in the backcountry and posts videos to YouTube of his travels. He said the FAA suspension of his license for 60 days came after 2 years of investigation and appeals and stems from an incident that occurred on November 24, 2019. Palmer was conducting an inspection pass over a friend's home airstrip to determine if he could land at the site. Pilots will use an inspection pass to check runway conditions and ensure a safe landing. They're usually conducted with multiple passes over the airstrip and high, medium, and low levels before landing. Palmer said, quote, I realized that I wasn't really able to identify the touchdown point for that landing spot. I opted to move on. Palmer said several days later he was asked to come in and speak with FAA officials who said that the friend's neighbor had provided footage of his inspection pass obtained from a doorbell camera. That meeting led to several more meetings that include the FAA's legal team and Palmer's attorney. His license was initially suspended for 210 days. The FAA charged Palmer with operating his aircraft at an altitude that could create an undue hazard to persons or property, flying too close to people, vehicles, and structures, and operating his aircraft in a careless or reckless manner. Palmer said the key to the first alleged violations is that they apply, quote, except for in cases of takeoff and landing, which he says he was conducting through the inspection. He argues the FAA recommends inspection passes like he conducted in its guidebook for small aircraft pilots landing in off-airport locations. It was more than a year before Palmer got his hearing, which he expected to last about 3 hours. Instead, it lasted for 5 days. Palmer said the judge that ruled on the hearing upheld all of the FAA's rulings on the violations, using the rationale that since Palmer didn't land, his low pass over the airstrip doesn't count as part of a takeoff or landing procedure. He also cited the lack of runway lights and a windsock in his ruling. Several pilot associations, including AOPA, have said that ruling could have negative impacts for many pilots conducting backcountry landings or evaluating off-airport locations to land. Palmer said he's planning an additional appeal, not because of the suspension, but because he is concerned his case will set a precedent for future cases against backcountry pilots. Quote, there would be external pressure making us change our aeronautical decision-making. It would force us to land even if we didn't think it was safe to try to avoid being violated, he said. There's a precedent set with this case that, should this decision be upheld, that could be very bad to not only me and my future backcountry flying, but to everyone else. From avweb.com, pilotless plane crashes into house. Canadian authorities are investigating after a Citabria with no pilot on board crashed into a house under construction in the southern Alberta city of Medicine Hat. Global News spoke with Jenman Luke, the owner of the house, who said the aircraft's owner said the aircraft was undergoing maintenance at the Schlenker Airport, a grass strip about 5 miles south of the city. Quote, it just took off. Once the engine started, it just took right off, Luke quoted the owner as saying. The plane took flight about 8:30 p.m. on May 2nd, and the aircraft flew several miles before hitting the house, which is in a residential subdivision a little more than a mile from the city of 65,000's main airport. The plane hit a deck across the back of the house, and Luke said the damage to his house was minimal. There were no injuries. The Transportation Safety Board is sending investigators to the scene. From MercuryNews.com, which is a newspaper in San Jose, California, Google will finish fast revamp of Hangar One in Mountain View by 2025. Google aims to complete a mammoth revamp of the iconic Hangar One in Mountain View by 2025. NASA officials said Friday they hope the Moffett Field site will become a hub for tech, space, and aviation breakthroughs in the future. Google entered a 60-year lease with NASA in 2015 to take over the space. The company's Planetary Ventures unit began a vast restoration this week. A years-long effort led by Representative Anna Eshoo, whose district encompasses parts of Santa Clara County, overcame the one-time preference on the part of both NASA and the U.S. Navy to demolish the landmark due to the expense of a full-fledged rescue of the hangar, which was born in 1932 as a Depression-era construction project that employed hundreds and housed the U.S. Macon airship. Eshoo said, quote, "This is a hallelujah moment. It marks the historic beginning of the restoration of our iconic Hangar One. I call this operation tenacious." Eshoo said that she and Representative Zoe Lofgren, her ally in the quest to rescue Hangar One from the wrecking ball, were able to prevail in a battle that began in earnest in 2005 when the Navy proposed the demolition of the hangar after toxic chemicals were discovered in the structure in 2002. In 2012, a Google proposal to revamp Hangar One and other sites at Moffett Federal Airfield was languishing and gathering dust on a government shelf when Eshoo and Lofgren coaxed Daniel Tangerlini, then the director of the U.S. General Services Administration, to visit the site. That helped to turn the tide in favor of preserving and restoring the structure. The hangar is so vast and high that the Statue of Liberty, if removed from its pedestal, could stand upright inside Hangar One. And San Francisco's Salesforce Tower, which, as I recall, is around 1,100 feet tall, if laid on its side, could be tucked away inside the cavernous space. The inside of Hangar One has enough space to allow areas for Google engineers to work once the tech company's Planetary Ventures moves into the site upon completion. And I've been in that hangar years ago. It's absolutely massive, and it's great to see that it will be finally restored. Currently, it's just a skeleton, a steel skeleton, because the skin was removed a number of years ago. From NBCSanDiego.com, pilots weren't certified to fly a corporate jet that ran off runway in Kearney Mesa last year. A corporate jet that ran off the runway at Montgomery Gibbs Executive Airport in Kearney Mesa last year was piloted by two men who were not qualified to fly the aircraft, according to an FAA report. Not only that, but the plane wasn't going fast enough and was 3,000 pounds overweight based on the length of the runway. The crash happened on February 13th, 2021, just before noon, as the plane was taking off. The jet, a Dassault Falcon 900EX, ran 560 feet off the runway, which sheared off its three landing gear. Both wing fuel tanks breached, causing a large fuel spill, which did not catch fire. 5 people were on board, including 3 crew members. The pilot in command was the only person hurt, which was a minor injury. The FAA report states that Scott Kitchens was the PIC, but indicates that he doesn't hold a valid pilot certificate, which had been revoked 2 years prior to the crash. The other pilot, Nathan Russell's credentials prohibited him from piloting an aircraft without a properly licensed pilot in command, but neither of the men were certified to fly that particular type of aircraft. The information in the report closely matches new claims made in a civil filing regarding aviation insurance. Court documents show that upon takeoff, Kitchens and Russell were unqualified to operate the aircraft that never lifted off the ground and was forced to abort the takeoff. These documents say this resulted in over $75,000 in damages. The complaint was filed by USAIG, an aviation insurance company that was covering the jet, who was suing Aerospike Iron LLC and Charles Brandis as a result of this crash. From ABC12.com, ex-military pilot sentenced to 1-year probation after threatening to steal a helicopter. An ex-military pilot will be on probation for a year after threatening to steal a helicopter in an effort to free COVID patients from local hospitals. 72-year-old Jesse McFadden of Omer, Michigan, pleaded no contest to possessing a loaded firearm in a motor vehicle punishable by up to 2 years in prison. He was sentenced last week to 1-year probation. Several charges were dropped as part of the plea. It was back in May 2020 when police say McFadden went to the U.S. Coast Guard station Saginaw River in Essexville, Michigan, to get a helicopter and attack a hospital to release COVID-19 patients. McFadden was later arrested. His defense attorney said that McFadden, a former military helicopter pilot, is now legally blind and had no way of physically carrying out the threats he made in May of 2020. And finally, from paddleyourown.canoe.com, unruly passenger who managed to open door in flight is sentenced to just 1 year in jail. A drunk and violently unruly passenger who physically managed to open the outer aircraft door of a United Express jet in the final moments before landing has been sentenced to just 1 year behind bars for interfering with flight crew. The maximum permissible sentence is 20 years imprisonment plus a $200,000 fine. Cameron C. Stone, 30 of Fairfax, Virginia, was sentenced on Monday, where he was also ordered to pay a fine of $7,500 and undergo 3 years of supervised release. Stone also faces a separate fine from the TSA. Following Stone's attempt at opening the aircraft door, the pilots of the Embraer E-45 regional jet operated by Commute Air on behalf of United Express were forced to declare an emergency as a flight attendant, 2 passengers, and an off-duty U.S. Marshal held on to Stone and pulled him back from the door. Stone reached a plea deal with prosecutors in February, in which he admitted 2 counts of interfering with flight crew and assault following the Cirrus April 16, 2021 incident. Witnesses described how Stone had been loud and obnoxious during the 2.5-hour flight from Dulles to Pensacola, Florida, and that he smelled strongly of alcohol. Stone verbally harassed and made finger guns at other passengers, which led to a flight attendant being forced to frequently reprimand him. At one point, Stone got up from his seat, reached for the cockpit door, saying, "I'm trying to get out of here." The flight attendant blocked the door and ordered Stone to take his seat. During the final descent into Pensacola, Stone once again stood up and approached the cockpit. The flight attendant tried to block him, but he ran into her, pushed and grabbed her, and then hit her head against the side of the galley. He then managed to partially open the main cabin door, activating an alarm in the cockpit and triggering an emergency landing. The flight attendant desperately held onto Stone's hand to prevent him from fully opening the door and screamed, "Close the door," as she tugged on the handle to close the door. 3 passengers leapt from their seats and jumped on Stone and then restrained him until law enforcement boarded the aircraft. Some modern jets have cabin doors fitted with flight locks, which physically lock the door when the aircraft reaches a certain speed. In all cases, it's impossible to open a cabin door at altitude because of the pressurization of the aircraft, but this has less effect in the final phases of a flight when the aircraft is close to the ground. That's the news for this week. Coming up next, the final mistake in a long line of mistakes and rule violations that brought down a Pilatus PC-12 in South Dakota. Plus more of your feedback and questions, all right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. Last week, the NTSB released the public docket of information about a PC-12 that crashed immediately after takeoff in South Dakota in November 2019. The docket includes a number of photos and videos that I'll describe later in a transcript from the cockpit voice recorder installed on the plane. 9 people were killed and 3 were injured. Members of a prominent eastern Idaho family were returning home from an annual South Dakota hunting trip when the crash occurred. In an aircraft performance and simulation study conducted in September 2021, the NTSB found that the pilot of the aircraft made several operational errors from his attempts to remove snow and ice, an overweight aircraft, to the conditions during takeoff that led to the crash. There were 4 generations of family members aboard, including one of the elder sons, who was presumed to be the pilot. There were only 8 passenger and 2 crew member seats on the Pilatus PC-12, but there were 2 more people on board than seats, according to the report. Passengers 9 and 10 are assumed to be seated in the aisle of the passenger cabin, according to the aircraft performance and simulation study. The flight was 100 pounds overweight, according to the report. Seatbelts for those who were seated were found buckled, unbuckled, and cut. First responders reported that some passengers were buckled into their seats while some were not. The following comes from the factual report. On November 30th, 2019 at 12:33 p.m., a Pilatus PC-12 47E airplane, November 56 Kilo Juliet, was destroyed when it was involved in an accident near Chamberlain, South Dakota. The pilot and 8 passengers were fatally injured, and 3 passengers were seriously injured. The airplane was operated by the pilot as a Part 91 personal flight. The pilot and passengers flew to Chamberlain Municipal Airport, that's 9 Victor 9, the day before the accident, arriving around 9:27 a.m. The airplane then remained parked outside on the ramp. A representative of a local lodge reported that the pilot and passengers stayed overnight. The morning of the accident, the pilot and 1 passenger stayed back while everyone else went hunting. The representative took the pilot and passenger to the airport to check on the airplane. The pilot thought there would be favorable weather between 11:30 a.m. and 2:30 p.m. They took a ladder from the lodge and stopped at a local hardware store to buy isopropyl alcohol. The pilot and passenger worked for about 3 hours to remove the snow and ice that had accumulated on the plane overnight. The representative noted that the ladder they brought from the lodge was approximately 7 feet tall and did not reach to the top of the tail on the airplane. The lodge representative asked the pilot not to head out and mentioned they had room for them to stay another night back at the lodge. The pilot stated that they needed to get home, that the airplane was 98% good, and the remaining ice would come off during takeoff. And we'll talk more about the ice in the tail later. Note, by the way, that NTSB's Safety Alert SA006, called Aircraft Ground Icing, says, among other things, that, quote, pilots should be aware that no amount of snow, ice, or frost accumulation on the wing upper surface should be considered safe for takeoff. It's critically important to ensure by any means necessary that the upper wing surface is clear of contamination before takeoff. Getting back to the report, the lodge representative recalled that it was snowing hard at the time the pilot took off. At 12:24, the pilot phoned at Minneapolis Center and requested an IFR clearance from 9 Victor 9 to Idaho Falls Regional Airport, which is IDA. The pilot advised he planned to depart from runway 31 and would be ready in 5 minutes. At 12:27, Center issued an IFR clearance to the pilot with a void time of 12:35. No radio communications were received from the pilot, and radar contact was never established. Data recovered from the Lightweight Data Recorder, or LDR, installed on the airplane revealed that the accident takeoff began from runway 31 at 12:31:58. The airplane lifted off 30 seconds later and immediately entered a left turn. Initial airplane bank angles varied from 10 degrees left wing down to 10 degrees right wing down. Ultimately, the airplane reached a bank angle of 64 degrees left wing down at the aircraft's peak altitude of approximately 380 feet AGL. The airplane then entered a descent that continued until impact. The airspeed varied between 89 and 97 knots during the initial climb. However, it decayed to about 80 knots as the airplane's altitude and bank angle peaked. The stall warning and stick shaker became active approximately 1 second after liftoff. The stick pusher became active about 15 seconds after liftoff. All three continued intermittently for the duration of the flight. A witness located about a half-mile northwest of the airport reported hearing the airplane take off. It was cloudy and snowing at the time. He was not able to see the airplane, but noted that it had entered a left turn based on the sound. He heard the airplane for about 4 or 5 seconds, and the engine seemed to be running good until the sound stopped. The airplane was approved for day-night operations under visual and instrument flight rules, including flight into known icing conditions. The accident airplane was configured with 2 flight crew seats and 8 passenger seats, a total of 10 seats. However, 12 individuals were on board during the accident flight, and none of them qualified as lap children, less than 2 years of age, under FAA regulations. An estimated weight and balance calculation for the accident flight indicated that the airplane was about 107 pounds over the approved max gross weight. Center of gravity calculations indicated that the airplane was loaded 3.99 inches to 5.49 inches beyond the aft CG limit. The CG range was estimated assuming the unseated occupants and baggage were either all in the forward cabin, which would be the most forward CG, or all in the aft cabin, most aft CG. An image study of photos and video footage revealed accumulated precipitation, presumably snow, on the upper surface of the horizontal stabilizer and on the vertical stabilizer, with icicles present on the horizontal stabilizer bullet fairing with the airplane parked in the airport ramp and as it began to taxi before the takeoff. According to the airplane flight manual, the specified takeoff rotation speed at max gross weight in icing conditions was 92 knots. Observations indicated that winter weather had persisted for 12 to 24 hours in the vicinity of the accident site. Light to moderate snow, freezing drizzle, and mist occurred throughout the night and morning, with 2.1 inches of accumulated snow from 7:30 the day before the accident until 7:30 on the morning of the accident. Surface observations indicated low instrument flight rules conditions existed about the time of the accident. The observations taken at 12:15 p.m. noted light snow. However, moderate snow was observed at 12:35. Atmospheric sounding data indicated that moderate or greater airframe icing conditions were likely from the surface to 11,500 feet MSL. AirMed advisories for moderate turbulence, moderate icing conditions, and IFR conditions due to precipitation Mist, fog, and blowing snow were in effect at the time of the accident. The pilot's most recent pre-flight weather briefing was obtained at 12:04. It included current surface observations, METARs, pilot reports, PIREPs, and terminal aerodrome forecast, that would be TAFs. The pilot did not request the current AirMed information as part of the briefing. The airport manager reported that he was plowing snow at the airport beginning at about 8:30 and estimated that up to 2 inches had fallen over the past 24 to 36 hours. In his opinion, the weather seemed to be deteriorating at the time of the accident. The airport manager stated that the pilot spent some time removing ice and snow from the airplane before the passengers arrived. He added that the pilot was pouring liquid on the airplane and appeared to be chipping away at the ice. The pilot commented, "It's coming off pretty good," which he interpreted to mean the ice. The accident site was located approximately 3/4 miles west of the airport in a cornfield. The lodge owner took photos of the aircraft while it was on the ramp and took 2 videos of the aircraft, one as it taxied away from the ramp and another as it took off. The NTSB did intensive study of the photos and compared them with photos shot by Pilatus from the same distance and angles. The first photo shows the aircraft is on the ramp and a person is using a tool to de-ice the left wing. There is a ladder visible near the nose of the aircraft. The photo shows accumulated precipitation build up above the leading edge of the horizontal stab. It also shows accumulated precipitation had built up on the vertical stab and icicles were present on the horizontal stab bullet fairing. There is visible moisture falling present in the photograph. From the video of the aircraft taxiing away, the elevator is down, which is normal, and the photo shows accumulated precipitation visible on the top surface of the horizontal stab. And, by the way, it makes sense that there would be snow and ice on top of the horizontal stab as the pilot borrowed a 7-foot ladder, which would not have been tall enough for him to reach the top of the tail. Hence, that area could not have been cleaned of snow and ice. Back to the report. An airplane performance study in a PC-12 Level D full flight simulator, or FFS, was completed by the NTSB. The simulations indicated that the flight control authority available to the pilot was sufficient to maintain control until the airplane entered an aerodynamic stall about 22 seconds after liftoff. The maximum bank angle of about 64 degrees occurred after the critical angle of attack was exceeded. Furthermore, the simulations did not reveal any significant airplane performance degradation resulting from the residual snow and ice on the empennage. Although the effects of these accumulations on the airplane CG and airflow over the horizontal stab, which could have affected the elevator hinge movements and column forces, are unknown. Airplane loading on the previous day's flight from IDA to 9 Victor 9 was likely similar to the accident flight in terms of being both overweight and extreme aft CG. The LDR data revealed that the takeoff from IDA the prior day involved a rotation pitch rate of approximately 4.3 degrees per second, a pitch angle above the 9-degree flight director target, and pitch oscillations that may have been due to decreased stability and light column forces. A review of previous takeoffs known to have been flown by the accident pilot revealed similar rotation pitch rates and pitch angles beyond 9 degrees. The accident takeoff pitch was initially 11.8 degrees, where it paused for less than 1 second, before continuing up to 15.8 degrees. And just to repeat that, the flight director called for a pitch of 9 degrees, but the pilot pitched all the way up to 16 degrees on takeoff. Rotation was initiated about 88 knots, which was about 4 knots slower than the specified for takeoff at max gross weight in icing conditions. A comparison of LDR data revealed differences in the takeoff rotation technique between the accident pilot and another pilot who flew the airplane. Takeoffs performed by the second pilot employed takeoff rotation pitch rates of 3 degrees per second and a lower pitch angle of 5 degrees before gradually increasing to 9 degrees. The piloted simulations conducted in the Level D simulator suggested that the accident pilot's rotation technique, which involved a relatively abrupt and heavy pull on the column, when combined with the extreme aft CG, heavy weight, and early rotation on the accident takeoff, contributed to the airplane's high angle of attack immediately after rotation, the triggering of the stick shaker and stick pusher, and the pilot's pitch control difficulties. The resulting pitch oscillations eventually resulted in a deep penetration into the stall region and subsequent loss of control. The simulator participants found the takeoff much easier to control using a rotation technique that involved lower pitch rates and angles than the technique used by the accident pilot. Now here's part of the transcript from the cockpit voice recorder. At 12:17, which would be 16 minutes before the crash, a passenger can be heard reciting the traveler's prayer. He said, in part, "Our Father in heaven, we're grateful that we've been able to come out here to South Dakota and have a wonderful time with family. We appreciate the blessings that we enjoy, and we're thankful that we can be together on this Thanksgiving weekend. And we appreciate everything that God does for us, especially providing us a Savior, and we appreciate Him very much." And it continues and finally concludes, "Amen." 5 minutes later, at 12:22, the pilot listened to the AWOS, which said, "Chamberlain Municipal Airport, automated weather observation, 1820 Zulu, weather, wind 010 at 7, visibility 3/4, light snow, ceiling 500 overcast, temperature 1 Celsius, dew point 1, altimeter 2930, increased waterfowl and bird activity near the runway." 2 minutes later, at 12:24, the pilot called Minneapolis Center on his cell phone to get his clearance, and at 12:27, he read back the clearance. "Chamberlain to India Delta Alpha via direct climb and maintain 8,000. Contact Minneapolis Center, 125.1, squawk 3653. Clearance release until 1835, and it's currently 1827.5, 56 Kilo Juliet." A minute later, the pilot called on the CTAF and said, "Chamberlain area traffic, Pilatus 56 Kilo Juliet, taxiing to runway 31, going to back taxi 56 Kilo Juliet, Chamberlain." A half minute later, the airport manager came on the radio and said, "Hey, you got a copy there?" And the following conversation occurred between the pilot and airport manager. "I got a copy. I was going to go down and back taxi 31. Is that work for you?" "It don't look good to me. I don't know what you guys are thinking. Is the runway in good condition?" "I wouldn't say. I can't hardly keep up." "All right, I'll be okay. 56 Kilo Juliet." "What's that?" We're going to be just fine. I'll go back taxi 31 and we'll take off out of here, 6 Kilo Juliet." "Okay, the runway is not clear." "Oh, I thought that you had the, let me back taxi down and look at it, then I'll be back." "Why, you guys are crazy. I got berms on this thing. I got to get the snow out of here." The pilot then talks to the right seat passenger and says, "I wonder what he's been doing for the last 2 hours. And the airport manager says, "That don't look good to me." Pilot responds, "I think we're going to be just fine right down this one track you've made here, 6 Kilo Juliet." The airport manager responds, "Guys, don't mind. Problems with plowing through some drifts." At 12:31, just 120 seconds before the crash, the pilot continues talking to the right seat passenger. "He's been out here for 2 hours. In my pickup, I could have done it in like 30 minutes. And the pilot continues, "Oh, that's a nice track right here. We're fine. This thing will take off so fast." And the co-pilot seated passenger says, "How much space do you need?" He says, "I need most of the runway, but I'll be good. If he gave us a decent place to turn around down here." You then hear sounds of the RPM increasing. "Okay, can you hold that?" "Okay, we're set. Probes on. Condition lever." Then you hear the RPM increase. The aircraft takes off. Shortly after takeoff, you hear "stall, stall, stall" in an automated voice. Again, you hear "stall," and then "stall, stall," and then finally 6 stalls in a row, followed by the sound of heavy breathing and the words, "Oh no." More heavy breathing, more stall sounds. Finally, you hear "uh-oh, hold on," and a couple seconds later, the thud of a crash. According to the NTSB report, the pilot was a 48-year-old male who held a private certificate with single-engine land and multi-engine ratings. He had a total of 2,314 hours, 1,274 hours in the make and model, the Pilatus. He had just 43 hours of time in the PC-12 in the prior year, 10 hours in all aircraft types in the prior 90 days, and just 2 hours in all aircraft types in the prior 30 days. Now, in my opinion, 43 hours per year is probably just barely enough time to stay proficient in any complex aircraft, much less a PC-12. The pilot's last recurrent training, which was in the PC-12 aircraft, was a year and a day prior to the accident. The year before that, he trained in a simulator at SimCon. So if he trained in the aircraft or the simulator every year, he was due for his annual recurrent training right around the time of the accident. The takeoff video shows the aircraft departed as moderate snowfall is falling. About 6 seconds after rotation, the aircraft disappears into the snow and clouds, and just 30 seconds after rotation, the plane crashed. A comment on catherinesreport.com pointed out that there is no heated hangar or de-icing capability at the airport. Someone else commented that a typical pro-pilot crew would not have left the aircraft there overnight with the possibility of snow and ice, and instead would have relocated the airport to another airport where they could have gotten a heated hangar. The NTSB has not issued the probable cause. Most likely, I think they'll say that the aircraft stalled as a result of the pilot over-rotating and pitching too high during the takeoff. He then failed to maintain sufficient speed, stalled, and crashed the aircraft. Contributing factors are likely to be snow and ice contamination on the airframe, an overloaded aircraft, and an aft CG. What the report probably won't say is why the pilot thought it was safe to take off in these conditions. But we can say for sure that the pilot exhibited one or more of the FAA's hazardous attitudes. The pilot clearly knew that he had more passengers on board than the aircraft had seats and seatbelts, which is a per se violation of the FARs. The pilot should have also known that he was flying overweight and with a CG that was further aft than permitted by the POH. Now this falls under the anti-authority or don't tell me hazardous attitude. Pilots with anti-authority attitude tend to believe that the rules, regulations, and safety procedures don't apply to them. As I've mentioned before on the show, an NTSB study showed that 30% of fatal accidents involve a violation of one or more FARs. Also, recall the pilot's comments about the airport manager's work to plow the runway when he said, "What's he been doing for the last 2 hours? He's been out there for 2 hours, and my pickup, I could have done it in like 30 minutes. This certainly smacks a little bit of hubris or the FAA's macho hazardous attitude in which pilots are trying to impress others and also prove themselves by taking unnecessary risks. Now, the pilot undoubtedly felt self-imposed pressure to get the family back home on time, yet he was about to do one of the most difficult tasks any GA pilot can do. Not only was he flying single-pilot IFR, but he was about to take off in 1/2 mile visibility. And it had been a full year since his last recurrent training, and he had only flown 43 hours in that year. So it's unlikely that he was proficient in flying in these most difficult of conditions. And the flight data recorder proves that, showing that he rapidly rotated to about 16 degrees, causing 3 of the plane's warning systems, the stall warning, stick shaker, and stick pusher, to activate within 15 seconds after liftoff. Had any one thing been different, the pilot and his passengers might have survived. But he was flying over max gross weight, with a CG that was beyond the aft limit. There was snow and ice and contamination on the tail. There were 2 more passengers than seats, and the pilot hadn't flown much in the year since his recurrent training. On takeoff, he over-rotated as he disappeared into a 1/2 mile visibility in clouds. It was just one mistake too many. Coming up next, your emails and feedback, all right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And I'll get to your questions and feedback in just a moment, but an interesting story just came out as I was finishing the podcast, so I wanted to share that with you. The story is all about a passenger who landed an aircraft at Palm Beach International Airport after the pilot became incoherent. And this comes from clickorlando.com and a lot of other sources. Air traffic controller helped a passenger land. A passenger landed a private plane at Palm Beach International Tuesday after an incident with a pilot. According to a report from WPBF in West Palm Beach, the pilot of the single-engine Cessna 208 Caravan contacted ATC after the pilot had, quote, gone incoherent. The passenger told the air traffic controller that they had no idea how to fly a plane or even where they were, other than off the coast of Florida, the report continues. The report says that the air traffic controller at the Fort Pierce Tower helped the passenger descend the plane to 5,000 feet so that they could locate the plane on radar according to audio of the incident, and then told the passenger how to work the plane and land it safely. After the plane landed, one person was taken to a nearby hospital, but their condition was unknown. And I watched a video of the landing, and they did a great job. Now, I have, I think, about 70 hours in a 208, and it's kind of like a big 206, so it's not terribly difficult to land if you're a pilot. But, of course, this is pretty remarkable that a non-pilot landed the aircraft. And we've heard of stories like this, but not for quite some time. I recall that there was a wife of a husband and a twin back in around 2012 the lady landed the aircraft after her husband suffered some type of medical event. But let's now get on to your emails and questions. This comes from Inderpaul in New York. He's an MD. He says, I wanted to share an experience that I had this past weekend. We have all heard about hypoxia and how different people get affected differently in their own unique way. You had covered this very nicely in a prior episode. I was flying at 9,500 feet over the East Coast on the way back from Atlanta to Long Island. I checked my pulse oximeter after a feeling of air hunger. My pulse ox read 81%. After a few deep breaths, I got it up to 88. On answering ATC for a frequency change, I noticed that I had slurred speech. I did not notice any headaches, nausea, or even feeling of euphoria. I asked and got down to 7,500 feet for the rest of the flight with a saturation of 96%. I wanted to share this experience with you so that listeners can appreciate that hypoxia can be very insidious. I was able to recognize my symptoms because I had taken the hypoxia training by the FAA at Oshkosh, and also because I'm a physician. Well, Paul, thanks so much for sharing that. And I've found in general that if I'm up around 10,000 feet for an hour or so, boy, I really feel a little bit lethargic. So 7,500 is kind of my preferred altitude to be at for longer trips. And here's an email from patron supporter Joe Morales. He says, Hi, Max. I've been listening to the show for several years now and thoroughly enjoy it. My son and I are getting ready for our CFI check rides, and your show has helped us get ready for all of our previous check rides. Thank you. I was listening to episode 228 and the discussion of VFR into IMC, and I have two things I'd like to share with you. The first thing is that in the discussion of Rob's short encounter outside Chicago, he mentioned that he knew he couldn't go higher due to the Class B shelf sitting on top of where he was. And he says later in the show you both discussed how pilots shouldn't be afraid to challenge ATC and utilize their pilot and command authority when appropriate. I just thought the same would apply in this instance. Yes, I totally agree. Excellent point. One should never hesitate to request a Bravo clearance if you think it's going to help you in some way. And continuing on, he says, the second thing I wanted to bring up deals with flying at night and VFR into IMC. This is something that occurred to me a while ago. I was on a VFR flight at night cruising at 7,500 feet. I checked the weather, departure, and destination, and en route as usual. It was VMC all the way, and in my briefing, there was to be not a single cloud in the sky. As I was monitoring my iPad weather, I kept seeing green dots en route as expected. Getting closer to my destination, things were looking a little weird. I had flown this route in the past several times, and I started noticing that the ground lights were less dense than I was used to seeing. Again, looking at the iPad, it all looked green, and the sky looked beautiful above. I checked the weather at the destination again, and it was sky clear, below 12,000 feet and 10-mile visibility. I then checked one of the airports closer to where I was at the time, and that's when it hit me. There was a cloud deck from 4,500 to 6,000 feet below me for about 40 miles. Not a big deal. I could descend below the deck, stay VFR on top, or ask for an IFR clearance. The lesson was, however, that although all the little green dots told me that the fields below were VFR, there was a deck of clouds that I was not expecting, and at night couldn't really see. My only clue was the lights below weren't what I was usually expecting to see in the area. I reached my destination without incident, but had one lesson for the flight. There is always at least one each flight. Keep up the good work. Well, that's a good point, and this really helps to explain why pilots are 10 times more likely to fly into a cloud at night than in the daytime, and that's because clouds are much harder to see and avoid at night. And here's an email from HR in Illinois. He says, Hi, Max. Listened to episode 229 today and cringed when I heard the argument between the tower controller and the CFI pilot that you played. I applaud the controller for keeping his composure as well as he did. Wondering if you can shed light on the phrase, maintain VFR altitude your discretion when on flight following, and when is it appropriate to notify of altitude changes? Sometimes they appreciate it, and at other times it's clear that they'd rather not be bothered. For example, along the lakefront in Chicago, underneath the Class B and C airspace, they often give altitude clearances to VFR aircraft that are less than the shelf and definitely want to know if you intend to climb. Well, HR, the first part is easy when they say maintain VFR. Essentially, you have to stay far enough away from the cloud so that you meet the cloud clearance requirements spelled out for different types of airspace. Let's take Class E, for example, since it's located most everywhere once you get above 700 or 1,200 feet AGL, as long as you're not in B, C, or D airspace. In Class E below 10,000 feet, we have to stay at least 500 feet below a cloud, at least 1,000 feet above a cloud, and at least 2,000 feet horizontally from a cloud. And we're required to do that to protect the IFR aircraft that might be in those clouds and might suddenly pop out. You can't be right next to the cloud, as you need to be far enough away to have time to avoid these aircraft if one should suddenly come out of the cloud and be headed towards you. Now, the second part, which I think is probably the part you were most interested in, the phrase altitude your discretion, means that you can be at any VFR altitude, though I've noticed controllers don't always mean that, which I'll explain in a second. So any VFR altitude would be in any altitude that's within 3,000 feet of the ground, or if you're above 3,000 feet AGL and you're headed east, you should be at odd altitudes plus 500 feet, such as 3,500 or 5,500 feet. And if you're headed west, you should be at an even altitude plus 500, such as 4,500 or 6,500 feet. Most of the time when a controller says VFR altitude, your discretion, you can pick any altitude, and technically you don't even need to notify a controller when you change altitudes. But if you're in a busy metro area, either near a Class B or Class C airport, the controller might say something like, maintain VFR, advise before any altitude changes. In that case, there is so much traffic around you that they want you to ask for permission before you change altitude. But what I've noticed over the years when flying under the busy San Francisco Class Bravo, sometimes the controllers say, maintain VFR altitude your discretion, but they really do want to hear from you when you change altitude. Generally, the closer I am to the center of the Bravo, the more likely I am to advise the controller that I'm changing altitudes, even if they don't ask me to tell them that. And the farther away I get from the Bravo, the more likely it is that I don't mention altitude changes. Now, there is one situation where I'm close to the Bravo and I don't mention altitude changes, and that's when I'm descending as I head back to my home airport. The controller already knows where I'm going, and he or she knows that I'm likely to step down to stay below the Bravo, and pilots around here do that in a fairly similar fashion, so controllers can easily anticipate what we're going to be doing. So I'm sure they don't want to hear from me as I'm stepping down to stay under the Bravo shelf as I head back to my home airport. Great question. Thanks so much for sending that. And here's an email from Brian in Arizona. He says, just a quick note on episode 230, which was about the Cessna 208 Caravan crash that was near the Burley Airport in Idaho. He says, I think another thing to take into account with low visibility approaches is the approach lighting system. Just having reels, the runway and identifier lights, is not much. And yes, Brian, it's too bad there was no room for an approach lighting system there, since the runway is right next to the river, and those approach lights would have to be out over the river. Reels are nice and good visibility, but they probably aren't that helpful in the day in light snow and mist. And here's an email from Joe in Missouri. He says, Hi, Max. Love your show. Have a question about ATC vectoring that no one seems to be sure of the answer. When ATC gives you a heading, do you fly the heading or the ground track? With most planes having a GPS now, it's easy to see how our track can be different than heading with a strong crosswind. For example, on an IFR takeoff, ATC assigned me a heading to fly, but the wind was so strong I was tracking way off that heading as shown on the GPS. So which is best to fly when given a heading assignment? Thanks, Joe. Well, Joe, this is a question that I do know the answer to, and I'm quite sure of it. The answer is that you fly the heading that you've been assigned, and you ignore the ground track. There are lots of planes that are not equipped with GPS, so they wouldn't be able to fly a ground track anyway. The controllers see everyone's ground track, and it's up to them to figure out how the wind is affecting everyone's ground track. Sometimes they don't get it quite right. For example, I've seen intercept vectors to join an instrument approach that would take a long time to join the approach. You can always advise ATC and ask for a revised heading in that case so that the intercept occurs sooner. But definitely, when they ask you to fly heading, they mean it. Definitely do fly the heading. Forget about the ground track. That's their problem to figure out. And here's an email from Jonathan in Virginia. He says, please help. I can't get a straight answer. Well, Jonathan, you've come to the right place. I always try to give straight answers. He says, I have a private certificate for both rotor and fixed-wing aircraft. Which IFR should I pursue first, rotor or fixed wing? Which of the two might make getting the other one a little easier? Thank you so much for your help. Well, I've talked with two helicopter flight instructors, and they both gave me the same answer. One was Stephen Bush of Lone Star Helicopters in Texas, who's a former Patreon supporter, and the other was Rob Hyde, who teaches helicopters here in Northern California. And here's what they both said. Your initial rating will require about 40 hours of instrument time, and your second add-on rating will only require 15 hours. Both of them said if you're looking to save money, and who isn't, that it would be considerably cheaper if you do the 40 hours in an airplane versus in a helicopter. So that means you should get your instrument first in the airplane and not in the helicopter. Then after you complete that training in the airplane, you'll only need a minimum of 15 hours in the helicopter for the add-on rating. And I'll add this to what they said. I have one more idea which will save you a lot of money, and that's do up to 20 hours of your instrument rating in an AATD, which many people call a simulator. I almost always start new clients these days in the G1000 AATD at my flight school for a couple of reasons. First, it saves people a lot of money, and second, the simulator is a much better learning environment than either an airplane or a helicopter. And the reason is that we can pause the simulator and have a detailed conversation about what's going on, which is something we can't do in an airplane or a helicopter. I can also work on the whiteboard to help illustrate a concept that we're working on. And I can tell that clients are much more relaxed when we're in the simulator, and so I know they're able to absorb more. When we're in the airplane, you can tell clients are spending about half their brain cycles just trying to keep the wings level and stay alive, and they're not going to remember half of what I tell them in the airplane. So Jonathan, get your first instrument rating in an airplane and your second one in the helicopter, and if possible, use a flight training device or an AATD for the first 10 or 20 hours of your airplane instrument rating. And here's an email from a gentleman named Denver from Oklahoma. He says, referring to episode 230, in which I discussed the 208 that crashed into a building just short of the runway at Burley, Idaho, he says, you make a good case for putting red light bars on the roof of any large building on the extended center line of airport approaches. The FAA could subsidize $50 to $100 per month where necessary for electricity and upkeep. Of course, putting an actual PAPI or VASI on the field would be a good first step. An advisory glide slope based on reliable data, such as GPS WAS, sounds fantastic, but in marginal visibility, the pilot needs to remain heads up. So audible guidance would be helpful. I didn't hear you mention any terrain advisory or ground proximity warning. Yes, this airport could really use a PAPI or a VASI on runway 20. You raise a good point about the terrain advisory or ground proximity warning. In most piston Cessnas, there is a what used to be $9,000 option. I don't know what they charge now to the G1000 for the TAWS-B. And many pilots choose not to purchase that. I would certainly hope that when someone is buying a $2.5 million 208 Caravan that they would include that option. Note that when you're very close to the airport, TAWS-B is inhibited. So you won't get a pull up warning every time you land. But I don't know how close you have to be to the airport for that warning to be inhibited. So it's possible that this aircraft that crashed in Burley had the TAWS-B option, but that it was inhibited because they crashed so close to the airport. And here's an email from Rob in California. He says, on one of your shows a few years ago, you were talking about possible coordination between the FAA and Department of Defense to be able to have live information about active military areas that would be available to ATC and digitally. Which show was that? Rob, I'm afraid I don't even recall talking about that. So if anyone's listening recalls that, please let me know and we'll get that information over to Rob. And here's an email from Alan in California. He says, I meet on Zoom with a group that discusses the latest pilotworkshops.com scenario. This month, the problem was an ODP, that's an obstacle departure procedure, which I love because they always generate some good discussion. Buried in the resources was a set of KML files for the MVA-MIA, so minimum vectoring altitudes, by ATC region for the U.S. They are georeferenced, so they can be moved into ForeFlight, showing the minimum vectoring altitudes in each sector. The CFI in San Carlos, California, created them. There is no regular maintenance process, but they still explain a lot of things that happen on IFR flights. And he sends me a link, which I will put into our show notes if you're looking for that. He says, I wrote the creator about updates. He hadn't done them in a year, and he just went and updated them recently. So good information. Thanks for sharing that, Alan. And here's the email from Jim in Florida. He says, I'm trying to help a friend obtain information on aviation grants and or scholarships. Did you used to publish a list of available scholarships? You know, Jim, I think at times I did post scholarship information on my maxtruscott.com blog, but it's been a really long time since I have done that. He says, if so, I can't readily locate it. If you can point me to it. If not, do you know who does this? Note, I'm not referring to the AOPA or FAA lists of scholarships. Well, Jim, there used to be a printed book that you could buy. I bought it once and lent it to someone who I thought could use some scholarship help. But I think that book material has now been transformed into an online version, which to me makes a lot more sense, as it's easier to keep an online guide current than it would be the printed book. These days, if you go out to aviationcareerspodcast.com/scholarships, you will find that you can purchase access to the online scholarship guide for 1 year for $10 a year. Now, it's published by Carl Villari, who we had on the show way back in episode 108 when he talked about how to become an airline pilot. Hope that helps you. And speaking of helping people, my thanks to those of you who helped me out. You probably know some of these people. We've got a brand new mega supporter, Dan Morris, who has added his pledge up to $50 per month. Dan, thank you so much for the support. Only one new patron supporter in the past week. That's Nick Passmore out of Australia. Nick, thanks so much for supporting the show. And we have a one-time donation that came through PayPal from Gladys Ma for $25. She says, your two recent podcast, episodes 228 and 229, had me wanting to support again since I started IFR training. By the way, Gladys, can't wait to hear that you've completed that. She says, my home airport is Gillespie in San Diego, where the Learjet crashed in December 2021. So sad. Thanks for keeping us safe. Your knowledge is worth gold. And if you'd like to become a member to help support the show, boy, we could really use your help. This is the time of month where we lose probably 4 to 5 people every month because their credit cards expire, and most of those people don't go in to update the credit cards. So we're constantly looking for new supporters just to stay even. So if you would, please head on out to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome, and you can find a link in our show notes to that if you don't remember it. And when you go out there, go ahead and choose what dollar level you'd like to support us at, then enter a credit card. It really only takes a couple of minutes, and you'll be supporting the show, and I'll read your name on the show. Plus, you get all kinds of goodies at the different dollar donation levels. Or if you want to make a one-time donation, head on out to aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal, and you can make a donation just like Gladys did. And I really want to thank all of you for your contributions, whether it's through emails, whether it's leaving a 5-star review on your podcast player, or sharing the show with other people, all of your friends. Go ahead and take a moment and share this show with them. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up.